recording. And recording. So, well, wonderful, Sharon, to have you here today. For the ones who do not know you, you're Professor Dr. Sharon Thornton, have been teaching theology, especially practical theology, a long time on the East Coast and under Van Newton, but also here on the West Coast. Have been giving many workshops and worked with parishioners on aspects of trauma and death and dying. So I thought when I was supposed to prepare today, Holy Saturday, for this retreat that the Verbum Dei is given, and I'm one of the members of the Verbum Dei. My name is Julia, and I'm German for the ones who don't know me. And I thought, well, I really would like to interview my friend Sharon on the importance of Holy Saturday. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. This is really a special treat and an honor. Thanks, Julia, so much.
Oh, thank you. So, because I know many years ago you wrote a book on Good Friday, which has a beautiful title, Broken and Still Beloved. And I was wondering, your interest has then shifted to the interest of Holy Saturday. Why? What do you think caused that? Why did you get more interested in Holy Saturday?
Well, when I wrote the book, Broken Yet Beloved, I was really interested in connecting personal and societal realities of suffering. And I was searching for a way to sort of move out of simply the individualistic personal understanding of suffering and trying to make a connection to wider experiences and communal experiences of suffering. Because I really believe that if you limit your attention to one or the other, you really also limit your ability to address the realities of suffering on a very deep level. So that's what I did. And I, from a faith perspective, I focused on Good Friday, or the crucifixion, as a window into this reality. So I was interested in how a Good Friday lens could open up ways of addressing contemporary situations where crucifixions are still going on and suffering is still very, very prominent. Mm-hmm. But the shift came, I believe, as I began to realize that simply naming the pervasiveness of suffering and making the connections between individual suffering and wider understandings of suffering, societal and political understandings of suffering, it stops too soon. And so how does one live after the connection has been made, you might say? How does one live after the connection is made? So I began to kind of ponder that, and I began to ask then, what might be the meaning of what we celebrate as Holy Saturday today, as a way to begin to look at the day after, or how we begin to address the reality of suffering that we once analyzed and named. So much of the liturgy around Holy Saturday has focused on what happens to Jesus after he dies. And I began to, his descent into hell. Mm-hmm. And so I began to ask, what about how it happens to the followers the day after? Mm-hmm. What might have been their own experience of hell in the wake of their beloved one who suffered such a horrendous death? So that's sort of how my shift came around on that one.
Mm-hmm. Like, it's really interesting with the day after. Also, a lot of insecurity comes. I mean, on Good Friday, we know exactly what happens. But then on Holy Saturday, there is really kind of an uncertainty. I don't know what you would say to that. Like, how does this uncertainty speak to you?
Well, I think in the wake of any huge trauma, there's a deep, deep feeling of not just loss, but, bewilderment. Where do you go? How do I begin? How do I even take a next step? So uncertainty, I think, is probably just a very natural, human, spiritual reaction to a major, major disruption.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I think even if we look at that, in contemporary experiences of loss, think of when some of our leaders have been killed. I think of when Martin Luther King was killed. I think of when Kennedy was assassinated. I think of when Harvey Milk here in the Bay Area was assassinated. John Lennon was assassinated. In the aftermath of these, the whole huge swaths of the country were just, bewildered. What does this mean? What happens to everything that we've been committed to? How could this have really happened? So uncertainty, I think, is a very, very human and spiritual reaction to major disruption. Mm-hmm.
Why you call it, I think, in some moment, this kind of uncertainty, holy insecurity. What does it make holy for you?
What makes it holy? It means it's okay not to know.
Huh.
And our faith can't rely completely on certainty, or it wouldn't be faith.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, certainty alone would limit us to what we can see and what we can experience. Holy insecurity has to do with maybe recognizing that fact. And, how does one live with it? When you ask me that question, it makes me think of a time when I was pastoring the church in Chicago. And I had a member of my choir. His name was Justin. And Justin was dying of cancer. And on Easter Sunday, I preached a fairly traditional Easter Sunday, sermon. And afterwards, he pulled me aside and he says to me, Sharon, do you really believe all that? And, when somebody who's dying asks you a question like that, you can't just, mouth platitudes, and you can't just give, the party line, so to speak. And what I said to him, I said, most of the time I do. And when I don't, I rely on the faith of the community to carry me forward. It also happened that same Sunday. Our church had been going through a really, really rough time because we'd lost, something like about a half a dozen members, meaning who had died in the last month. And talk about insecurity. People were feeling incredibly vulnerable. Well, there was a church up the street from us, an Episcopal church. And our church had done a number of things together. And so the members knew each other a little bit. And that same particular Easter Sunday morning, their church got out a half hour early before ours. And as our church was beginning to exit, we heard singing out in front of the church. And their choir and church members had marched down to our church. They knew what had happened at our church, that there was so many people who had died in the last month. And there they were singing to us with their church banner, flinging the incense over us, and Christ the Lord is risen today. And, it spoke to our members and kind of cut through a sort of malaise that they were experiencing, so that you might say, in a way, their insecurity was blessed. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's one way of talking about holy insecurity. And that memory has stayed with me in such a profound way, over the years.
In a certain say, what you're saying, that we need community to go the next step, or to discover deeper hope that perhaps in us personally is not even there. You have been teaching so many years on death and dying. Does Holy Saturday have something to do with your experience of these topics, of teaching on death and dying, and ministers and seminarians on those topics?
I would say absolutely yes. And it even relates a bit to the question you were talking about, holy insecurity. I have taught for a number of years a course on death and dying. I called it Love Through the Seasons of Death.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found was so many students, both in my seminary classes and in workshops, came to the discussion with some sort of a preconceived notion that that you could find closure to your grief. If you went through the typical Kubler-Ross, venue, that you would end up with some kind of closure and acceptance, and you get on with life. Okay. Well, not all people get over their grief, and nor should people who don't get over their grief be forced to feel guilty about it. But many learn how to deal with their loss and put it in some kind of a perspective, without their loved ones still being present. So Holy Saturday can be that space where unimaginable grief is taken in and lived with in a powerful way. But then if you think about it, then resurrection, it doesn't quite look like a sudden turning on of lights or a brilliant fanfare of energy or
Fireworks.
Spiritual fireworks. It might be something much more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
It might be little surprises, especially that one can actually decide to go on living.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Jesus' wounds still showing, or I think of C.S. Lewis when he wrote about his, the loss of his beloved wife. And, he basically felt like he lost his faith and was, loath to go on. And one day, I think he was walking down a path and he turned, and her presence was to him something that had never been, before. And I think of just even small things like a little violet poking up through a crack in the sidewalk, or a gray world of grief. All of a sudden, somewhere there's a line of color that
Mm-hmm.
permeates that. So, what was your question?
No, why Holy Saturday? How it is really evolving with dealing with people who deal with death and dying, and I think exactly what you are saying. It's so fascinating that it is not our life, although we would like to. It is not a set of boxes or rules or things that start and then end and then have a firework and then go into victory, but that there is a lot of these life moments that are in between, or that are not clear, or that what you were saying, grief very often is not just over, but it can receive a different kind of perspective, and as it did in C.S. Lewis. But on the other hand, it's also a question of paying attention, not only seeing all the destruction, but actually how even in that trauma something can blossom or can give you a different perspective.
And that's a hard way to travel in this country, because this country doesn't have a lot of patience, with slowness. We're a very fast moving country, and we're supposed to be a very optimistic country. I mean, Douglas John Hall has called us the officially optimistic society. So if you don't fit into that mold, or if you can't, you feel like you can feel like you're a failure or something. But, I've known people whose lives are marked by grief, and who have lived rich, full, robust lives, not in the way they maybe did before, but in very rich and perhaps even more meaningful ways because of it.
Yeah, because you have written in some of, you have said the world cracks. Holy Saturday is like a time where the world cracks and loses its holds. And of course, when it cracks, when something cracks, something new can come out of it. As long as it is sealed, nothing new can come out. So, even with a seed, right, it needs to crack open.
That's a beautiful image.
Even lose, in a certain sense, hold. But how would you be able to say, like in this COVID-19, or in the circumstances we are in right now, how would you say that that's positive? Or perhaps it's not even positive, but to say it's important, because what you're saying right now is Holy Saturday, seems like really nearly countercultural. No, we're not expected to. We are not a country that wants to wait or have patience. Or so, what do you think to that?
In terms of the pandemic that we're in right now, you mean? Well, we don't know what life's going to be afterwards. We really don't. It could be. Personally, I don't believe we're going to go back to what we used to think of as normal. Things are going to change. We have already set too many things in motion that can't be reversed just like that. And what has happened, you talk about Holy Saturday as a time of perhaps breaking things open. I think it has revealed both some of I sort of think of it like a low tide time as to how things get revealed that are left on the beach. This pandemic has revealed the underbelly of some of the worst of who we are as a society.
Exactly. Yes.
It has revealed how we have lived with too much discrepancies in the way that we live, between those who are able to live, high on the scale, and those who are basically sleeping on our streets. It's revealed a tremendous amount of, greed and self-interest. And at the same time, I think of here in the Bay Area, nobody had any solution to what to do with people who are homeless. Well, now we seem to be putting them in hotel rooms. We seem to be finding ways to, it's not perfect, but we're finding ways that we never would have considered before. And then I also think of just this, it's revealed also some incredible networks of kindness and compassion. And on some very, very simple and local levels. Last week, one of my neighbors had her 100th birthday. And prior to this, there were plans for this big celebration for her 100th birthday, of course, which didn't happen. But a whole constellation of neighbors got together, and they went and they stood in front of her house, each one 6 feet apart. And they sang to her, and they brought balloons, and they basically had a big hurrah birthday party for her out in the street. And it was nice. It was, that's a very small thing, really, but what a lovely thing to see. Mm-hmm. And we've been getting, little notes pinned to our door saying, if you need anything, can we help you? The kids have been going around with chalk, making hearts in front of people's houses. there's been some incredibly lovely, very just simple human gestures. Even this is sort of out of character, but I've noticed in my email feed, people are sending jokes around, you know.
Yes, I do.
You know, so something has been cracked open in a way that is both revealing of our underbelly and also of what we're capable as being kind human beings to each other.
Yeah, that's actually very true. I mean, to say Holy Saturday has enabled us to send jokes around is probably something that we wouldn't have imagined to say about Holy Saturday a couple of years ago. It's really something of, a world breaking in ways that we just wouldn't have imagined.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Well, Sharon, I didn't want to hold you too long. The one of the last questions I wanted to ask you, though, is this Holy Saturday also is what you were saying, has a lot of social reflection. It has a lot of reflection in how to understand it regarding communities and regarding this anti-cultural slowness and not wanting to let go of any uncertainty or directly kind of paint over any uncertainty. You talked about holy insecurity. Now, one reasons why I was so grateful that you at all were able to talk today is because you yourself have been struggling with cancer and are in chemotherapy. Is there any thoughts of Holy Saturday in your situation that you're living right now?
Well, I don't have a lot to say at this point. I don't have a perspective that I've really, looked at this yet. But what I can say is, cancer doesn't have a definite outcome. So what will it mean to live with a less carefree approach? It has something to do with deeper levels of gratitude that I have, experienced through this time already. It has something to do with learning. For me, it's had a powerful effect on me, learning to receive instead and not just, be on the go, doing, giving, but to really receive the love and care of family and friends and even strangers. But I have to say, as I think about, about this question and how Holy Saturday and living the day after speaks to me, what continues to come to my mind is my mother's experience.
Hmm.
My mother lived a very, I would say, a tragic oriented life. Things happened in her life that should never have had to happen to her, beginning with the death of her own mother when she was 9 years old. But it culminated, I wouldn't say it culminated, but when she married she married late, and she married and had some years of beautiful experience with, the love of her life, and had 2 children. Well, when her 2 children were 3 and 5 years old, the family was vacationing on the Pacific Ocean, and her husband, their father, drowned in front of them.
No.
And I remember her telling me that she wanted to just walk into the water and just, die with him. But she looked at those 2 little kids and she realized that she couldn't abandon them. So I look at how this goes back to some of the earlier questions that you raised. I don't think she ever, quote, got over her grief, but she learned to live with it. And she learned to live with it by taking one day at a time, one step at a time. And she maybe never had that abandonment, you know, throwing your head back and laughing and just taking life for granted again. But she lived a life that was so meaningful, and she was a powerful presence in her children's and grandchildren's lives. And she was loving and compassionate, always loved kids. And she was a nurse by profession. But I look at the way that she lived the day after the death of her husband, and lived with incredible integrity, a minor keyed hope, I guess I would call it. Not a carefree hope. And to me, she really is an example of how, when you're living absolutely with insecurity, move forward and persevere. There's something about perseverance, and gave to life all that she could, even with that deep wound. So that's sort of has come to me again during these days.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. Would you like to say anything else about Holy Saturday that we haven't touched on in this conversation?
I don't know at this point. The one thing that I was thinking about today is, even though our liturgies have focused so much on what happened, you know, after Good Friday, it's interesting to me that part of the liturgies is normally a reaffirmation of baptismal vows.
Mm-hmm.
And those, saying the baptismal vows again, gives one a touchstone of where to begin living the day after with those promises. So maybe something about Good Friday has to do with promising again and taking the next step into life.
Thank you so very much, Sharon, for your sharing. Thank you so much for your time and your energy to be with me here in this conversation, and all the people who are on retreat and who are perhaps listening to this. So I will let you go at this point so you can take care of yourself again. And thank you again for everything.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for inviting me into your home.
Yes, details. Thank you very much.